You're listening to OK Podcast, a podcast by Sean Perrin about Radiohead.
About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead.
Welcome to OK Podcast, the show where I discuss the musical and cultural impact of the world's greatest band, Radiohead. Today on the program, my guest is Phil Rose, who is an international speaker who has taught at a number of Canadian universities. He's the author of a new book called Radiohead, Music for a Global Future, and we discuss his book, how historical events influence the band and their music over time, and why it's important to analyze a song's lyrics, even if they seem abstract or the associations are not immediately apparent. You can check out show notes for today's episode at okpodcast.com/7. Patreon supporters get early access to an extended ad-free version of today's podcast. You can learn more at okpodcast.com. Today's episode was brought to you in part by D'Addario. D'Addario makes some of the world's finest instrument strings and musical accessories right here in the USA. They're committed to sustainability as part of their business practice through the Playback program, which is a string recycling program that has recycled over 2 million sets of strings to date. For more information about this program and how you can help save the environment by recycling your guitar, bass, or orchestral strings, see D'Addario.com/playback. That's D'Addario.com/playback. Phil, welcome to the program.
Hi there, Sean.
So first of all, I was wondering if you could quickly introduce yourself to our audience and also tell me about how you fell in love with Radiohead as a band.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm a jack of all trades. I'm a bit of a musician, but I also teach in the university system here in Ontario, and I am Canadian, as is this program, if we can use that kind of language to describe it.
Absolutely, I'm proud of that.
Yeah. So I guess I came to Radiohead partially because I've done some work in the past on Pink Floyd and Roger Waters. And a friend of mine introduced me to Radiohead in the mid-1990s, a guy that I was actually playing and performing with, and we did a lot of the repertoire from the Benz and OK Computer. And, of course, specifically OK Computer just seemed very powerfully to express concern and themes that had also animated the work of Pink Floyd and Roger Waters, and things that I thought were of, pretty utmost importance. And so just in terms of, so many aspects of the band that I appreciated. We could talk about the songwriting, we could talk about the production of their work, we could talk about the way they've conducted themselves over the years, both in terms of navigating their path through the evolving, their evolving musical career, and also just the way they've conducted themselves ethically in a number of ways too that I sometimes explore in this book.
So what about your love of their actual music itself? Like, was there a particular moment or kind of song that led you to start viewing Radiohead as a band and as musicians as more elevated than your average radio music?
Yeah, I think it was probably Fitter, Happier, so powerful in its statement and in its encompassing really of the kind of concern I think that OK Computer expresses. I think that might actually be a track that most kind of compelled me to dive in much deeper, with my attention.
That's so interesting because that's not really a track you'd hear on the radio, and it's a track that a lot of people, I think, skip when they listen to the album. In fact, I just had on Steve Hamilton, who, as you may or may not know, he has done a project called Brahms versus Radiohead, and one of the tracks that he chose to skip was Fitter, Happier, and he made it seem like it was, for obvious reasons, but you're considering it one of the most compelling, if not the most compelling work on the album. So could you go into that just a little more? Like, what about its lyrical content or production did you feel really pushed it over the edge for you?
Well, a number of things really. So, for instance, the use of the computer voice, which is just symbolically powerful in a number of ways. One, I think, way I think pertaining to OK Computer itself is that, I talk about this in the book a little bit, that the what we might call the technological worldview has, in our time, kind of eclipsed what might be contrasted with that, the traditional worldview. So that so much of what technology brings us and has brought us, so for instance, efficiency in certain things, and in that song in particular, you can talk about the production of pork in the United States and how the number of industrial farms declined massively, and I don't have the numbers at hand, but at the same time as the production of pork increased. And so we have a kind of society that is highly directed towards fulfilling the sort of goals and biases that are embedded in our technologies. And I think that gets expressed really well through that computer voice. Another aspect I would attach to it is just when you find out, after you delve into it a while, you find out that the clip that's sort of looped throughout that track is from a film called 3 Days of the Condor, which is kind of misrepresented on the OK Computer sleeve as something different. But anyways, it's kind of reflective of all the operations in South America that the CIA were involved with, for instance, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Chile in 1973, and then just maintaining pressure and forces to combat essentially what were left-wing activists in all countries across, a number of them in South America during the 70s. So, that says just so much, just using a single little clip from a film.
Yeah, no, totally. And I love the way that in your beginning of your book here, you've contrasted Radiohead's timeline of releases and events with various other timelines. And we forget, for example, that the internet as a concept was so new back in 97. And, I don't even think that in my family household we got internet until 1999 or maybe even 2000.
That's interesting.
So,
yeah.
It's so new.
Yeah, related to that, it seems that Radiohead were among the first bands to have a website.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, emblematic of how they have constantly, seems to me, been on the cusp of navigating, the technological environment.
Well, it's also interesting to me, you identify all sorts of, connections, obviously, but just to go back in history a bit, the Berlin Wall, for example, was still standing when Radiohead was formed. This is giving us an indication of not only how long Radiohead's been around, but how they have also witnessed a lot of history. Obviously, the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York City in 2001 and numerous other events. Is there a point in Radiohead's career where you think they turned the lens of focus from sort of just what they wanted to accomplish musically to start trying to incorporate or be influenced by these kind of historical events, or do you think they've always been that way?
In the song The Bends, you have the lines, they brought in the CIA, the tanks, and the whole Marines to blow me away, to blow me sky high. Mm-hmm. And so to the extent that expresses kind of a similar paranoia that's actually embedded within the track we were just talking about there, Fit or Happier, concerned but powerless and empowered and an informed member of society, and all these kind of contradictions and the paranoia that's musically communicated in that track Fitter Happier. I mean, I think that's an inkling of it from the Bends, but I mean, I would say starting with OK Computer and moving, you know, after that album and beginning with that album, I think they've been firmly kind of commenting on the cultural environment.
Well, and you said Sulk was a response to a massacre as well, but you'd never know from looking at the lyrics. And I have to admit that not only that song do I not really, I can't even really think of the lyrics, but many Radiohead songs I find I'm not actually attracted to the lyrical content. I mean, I love York's songwriting. I think he's one of the best songwriters, but I'm often surprised to learn what the actual lyrics are, having misinterpreted them myself. So
right.
If the lyrics are so abstract, and that's one of the things I've commented before on this program, is how I love the abstraction of the lyrics. They let you kind of make it your own, and not to go too far off the question here, but even on Kid A, for example, I remember hearing that they were just kind of cutting lyrics up and pulling them out of a hat. So why should we focus on the lyrics and their historical context? What benefit is there to this outside of an analytical perspective?
Well, just first I'd mention that I think that habit went on for quite a long time, at least until Hail to the Thief, right? And so I think he used that technique for at least 3 albums.
Yeah. Are you talking about cutting up the lyrics and pulling them out of a hat?
That's right, and then pulling snippets from what they had there.
You think it started during the Bends?
Oh, no. I think it started during Kid A.
Oh, sorry.
Did I say the Bends?
No, my mind was stuck on Sulk, that's all.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think I mean, that was, I think, in response to what happened with OK Computer, which I deal with in one of the chapters, and you know, the excessive focus on the lyrics. I think it was an attempt, at first especially, to you know, de-emphasize the focus on York himself, but also on the specificity of the lyrics and whatnot, to make them kind of vague. But by the time you get to Hail to the Thief, he does talk about, you know, taking all those words kind of out of, you know, the news reporting at the time. And particular kinds of words he suggests were kind of sapped of their meaning. And from what he said, his attempt was to reinvest them with their meaning, or return their meaning to them, you know, through using them in the songs. So I think there is, I mean, for me, I think that the songs have lyrics typically for a reason, even if you're constructing them, you know, using methods of chance. You know, in the end, you still kind of, I think, you know, the assumption is there, at least on my account, that, you know, there's some intended meaning through that expression.
Well, an interesting thing that happened to me this summer, I went and saw the band in Montreal, and they played 2 concerts. And I remember a weird thing happening, and I'm a huge fan of Kid A, and I hadn't seen them in a long time, and I was really excited, and they played Everything in Its Right Place, and like, it was so powerful that I was like almost...
Sorry, what did you say? They played everything?
They played Everything in Its Right Place.
Oh, I see. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And so it was so powerful to me that I was nearly brought to tears. And I found this really odd thought coming into my mind. I was like, I can't believe here I am, a grown man, almost crying about a guy talking about sucking on lemons. Like, what is this even about, you know? And so I feel like the sometimes their lyrical content bypasses the mind and skips right to the emotions. And I just am wondering your thoughts on that.
I would actually say that, I mean, for me, the seductions of music are such that they can always override the lyric in terms of your perception of it, which is why I always, want to read the lyrics and listen to them at the same time. Because I think not only do you make yourself conscious of what they are, but you also become conscious of exactly how they are, intermingling with the musical processes and some of the nuances of meaning that occur with that. And it's interesting, in that regard that they stopped including the lyrics after OK Computer in the sleeve, and didn't do that again until Hail to the Thief. And I sort of suggest that that's probably because they'd kind of overcome the, existential crisis that followed OK Computer.
Well, and I feel that the abstraction of the lyrics on Kid A and Amnesiac especially was kind of meant to be up to the interpreter as far as the art form. And I've often found, and I wonder if you've had this experience as well, but I'll listen to a Radiohead song for sometimes even decades, and then one day I'll come across the lyrics. Maybe I'm trying to learn it as a cover for some reason or just for fun or whatever, and I'll come across the lyrics and I'll be just absolutely shocked that I've heard something wrong for 20 years. Do you have this experience too?
I don't think for that long, because I've actually I've gone to look at the lyrics, but I think, and I think I mentioned this somewhere, that unless for Kid A and Amnesiac, unless you were the type of fan that was going to go out of your way to even look the lyrics up online, then you'd probably be guessing them for years.
Yeah.
Because, certainly something like the track Kid A itself, it would be, it's kind of difficult to hear what those lyrics are because he's singing them through a vocoder and I think through, I don't know if it's the Ons Martineau or something.
Well, till this day, people argue about the lyrics on, for example, at the end of Morning Bell when he's speaking. I don't think anyone actually knows what some of those words are. Or even in Idiotech, the end, I've heard numerous interpretations of what those words are. Allegedly supposed to be.
and I mean, I think that this was all purposeful because you get York saying these things, they're never going to be there, kind of thing. For us to scrutinize, or he's never going to tell us what they are, kind of thing. But the one things that we can kind of see, things like the reference to Little White Lies that, you can discern in Kid A, tripping over Little White Lies. And then you get that phrase at the end in Motion Picture Soundtrack. They fed us on Little White Lies. I mean, by logic, those are kind of making connections with one another. Much as, Morning Bell appearing on both Amnesiac and Kid A are these, mechanisms that connect the material, in a bigger way.
I've always thought that was especially interesting because Morning Bell, I don't even believe it was a single from either album. And it happens to be one of my favorite songs, but they've never even played the Amnesiac version live.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, never have done it. So I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, if I ever get a chance to interview the band one day, that's going to be one of my questions.
Yeah.
What happened to that one?
That would be a good question.
Yeah.
Because, both versions are good, as you suggest.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess if I was Phil Selway, I'd probably want to play the other one.
Yeah.
But, he's patient enough to wait through a lot of other material.
That's true. So you've opened up the door to thousands of questions that I now have, but let's start here. So early in the conversation, about I guess a few minutes ago now, you were talking about how the band, that they started off their career and they're more focused on song form and all these different things. So York spent a lot of time actually wanting to, quote, be a pop star when he was younger. So why do you think he is such a recluse in these days that he didn't even bother showing up to his own Rock Hall of Fame introduction, but yet at the same time, in a rather contradictory way, is out protesting in the streets in London currently? He seems to have a real political bent, for example, but he doesn't seem to sometimes want to be involved in his own career.
I think he just, I think things tend to trouble him quite a bit, when he had expressed this idea of wanting to be a pop star kind of thing, I'm not sure he meant that. This was expressed in I think his graduation from university, some kind of yearbook or something. And that, that might have been read sarcastically. At the same time, it might have been genuine. We get comments from him about things like anyone can play guitar, and in reference to that, this idea of being in a band as being the best thing he can conceive of ever doing, like one of the best things you could do in life. Mm-hmm. So no doubt he thinks being, a musician is important and, fundamental to his thing. I think that sort of navigating the mediation, so to speak, of the band has always been something of a work in progress. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's interesting what you say about, connecting that to his activist life as well, because, somewhere he talks about how, doing that is quite difficult because, you've got to familiarize yourself with issues and be able to talk about them. But I think if we asked him, he would tell you that he found that kind of media work perhaps more significant than, the kind of promotional stuff that goes into, releasing albums and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. More commercial communications.
Well, they seem like that almost as a whole band. I mean, they're so dismissive of Creep that it's somehow become a rarity. And, contrast that with any other band. Take, AC/DC, for example. I don't know if they could even play a concert without Thunderstruck without risking career suicide.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just to do those kind of things and to not do what everyone is expecting you to do, I think has always been, just one of those pleasant things about them.
Totally.
And that they've always seemed to have quite a balanced self-perspective.
And, you commented a minute ago about something which I also wanted to touch back on. And, for those listening, I know you're probably thinking, like, you can't believe I don't know the lyrics to, a lot of the songs even sometimes. But it's almost for a selfish reason. Like, those are my own. I want them how I like them, almost. But you're sort of urging sometimes to analyze beyond what you hear for sake of looking into how the music is interplaying with the words on the paper. And this in classical music would be something called word painting. How do you think are some ways they've demonstrated this throughout their work?
Things like word painting, you mean?
Yeah, examples where they've used the words in conjunction with the music or production to kind of bring out meaning.
Okay, so I mean, one of the major sorts of tools for doing that is through genre references. Mm-hmm. And so, to give an example, the middle section of Paranoid Android, which they have referred to sometimes as the rain down section, and people will understand what I'm referring to that way, I think. It's employing this musical form, which probably most listeners could identify as actually kind of associated with Christian music historically. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think so. Yeah. I think that might be obvious to most people.
Yeah,
if it isn't.
Choir music, you mean like within a church?
Yeah, it's choral music, but it's also, it's harmony. I imagine maybe that listeners could also hear that in their harmony. I'm not sure if I'm giving people too much credit in terms of what they can hear, but it depends on what they're listening for. But in any case, that kind of a reference to religious music in a religious setting where you're also talking about the purification of water and rain and whatnot, in a situation where you can see that there is a quest on behalf of the character in the song for redemption.
Almost being reborn, or like baptized or something. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. And so also, an example, say, No Surprises. there's this use of the glockenspiel that they used for the first time. And, it's meant to convey a kind of child's music box, which is reflective of the sort of whole theme of No Surprises, and that, being, I don't want to be, have to be concerned, let alone terrified about what's going on in the world. No alarms and no surprises, please. So it's kind of embedding musically in that this kind of sense of childishness, if you will.
With that one too, it's actually tuned between two keys. I think they slowed the tape down so it sounds extra wonky, like a music box.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Hmm.
I think you're about to reference one more, were you?
No, I was actually thinking just for some reason of the other song they used the glockenspiel for, which is All I Need, and it's beautifully done.
Yeah, 20 years later.
Or
sorry, 10 years later.
The effect is different, and I don't think it's necessarily kind of significantly musically from a generic or genre sense there, but more as a kind of expression of the vast range harmonically. Like, it's very low synthesizer there combined with a quite high glockenspiel, and it just sort of is more about, I think, contributing a shape, but also it's pretty spooky sounding, isn't it?
You might be onto something there, because they've always said that there was this sort of connection between OK Computer and In Rainbows, and I think Tom York has even stated that he's surprised people haven't picked up on more of what they were trying to imply. So that's actually an interesting connection, that instrument was not used between OK Computer and In Rainbows in that way.
Yeah. And I mean, it's such a unique instrument to use, at least in my experience of consuming popular music. I haven't heard too many other people using it.
They've done this a few times with odd things, odd instrumentations that seem to be unique even to them. I mean, they use some sort of dollar store whirly thing or something on like spinning plates, and it's actually the exact same sound that you'd expect. And interestingly, it was the only instrument that was recorded forwards instead of backwards on the track. So they literally went down to the dollar store and picked up one of these like shaky things that sounds kind of woo during the music, and
right.
And it's the only time they've ever used that, and it's just such an odd thing. So
right.
So I guess that was my kind of sentiment as I was reading your book here, is that, and you do touch on it a fair bit, but that they tend to almost experiment musically as much as they do lyrically when they're trying to convey maybe some of the emotions or connections that they're trying to draw on. So
yeah.
So what connection do you feel? Because the one thing that they tend not to experiment on is the producer that they use. They've used the same producer with the exception of, I think, Pablo Honey and trying something else out on one occasion. But Nigel Godrich has been around for pretty much everything, and it sometimes makes me think that he might actually be the creative force behind the band. And I was sort of wondering your thoughts on that.
I think he must play an awfully key role.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it seems that quite rare for artists like that. I mean, it's very similar to, George Martin and the Beatles. Mm-hmm. Martin was pretty much with them most of the time, with the exception of the White Album, some of that, I think. Let It Be. But anyways, I think that he probably plays a central kind of, as being kind of in the band, but not in the band, a level-headed kind of outside, though inside voice, maybe.
Yeah.
A mediating role between them. Interesting that he is also, that Tom York has Atoms for Peace as a sort of actual performing band along with Nigel Godrich.
Yeah.
So I think they just, feel so comfortable and on the same level as him that it just seems to work, and there doesn't seem to be necessarily a sign that that's going to change, which I think is probably good, because I'm thinking, or as I was talking about that, I was thinking about Rush. I don't know if they're a band that interests you at all, but you know, they worked with this producer Terry Brown, more or less from their beginning until their album Signals, which I think was from '82. So more or less from '73 or something like that to '82, and then they switched producers, and it's kind of noticeably, you know, it's a noticeable switch when you look at the kind of history of their music. And to some extent, I wouldn't say that everything that followed Signals was necessarily, in terms of Rush, as successful project as those that preceded it. But I don't know. You know, probably people have different points of view about that. But it's interesting that a band like Rush did get to a point where they thought they had to work with somebody else. Mind you, that was 10 years, and here Radiohead are going still, you know, more than 20 years after hooking up with Godrich. So it's even outlasted the Beatles in that sense.
Well, it's strange too, because they've also kept their relationship with Stanley Donwood nearly that long. They're artists, and so the branding is clearly important to them from that perspective too. And the one interesting thing to me is that I would want to criticize them in a way for not experimenting more in that regard, but somehow Nigel Godrich has reinvented his sound along with the band's on every album.
Yeah.
That's a remarkable achievement.
I do think that they are. I mean, it's all such a nice combination, and it's good that you mentioned Stanley Donwood, because I guess you know, I think to some extent he's, you know, a lot more involved than might always appear. I mean, that gets a bit more obvious, I think, with an album like The King of Limbs.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You know, because to get inside The King of Limbs, you really got to read the newspaper that came with it. And my impression is, at least, that, you know, some of the things that are written in that newspaper are by Donwood rather than York. But,
well, that's the interesting thing too, is you mentioned Atoms for Peace with Nigel and Tom, and Stanley and Tom worked together as this Stanley Donwood and Dr. Chalk or whatever collaboration too. So it's kind of, it's weird that way. And the Radiohead artwork always seems to pick up on whatever Donwood is working on at the time, which then is inevitably related to whatever's happening politically in the world as well. So it's kind of like feeds on itself. It's really interesting to see.
That's right. And I think that he often, you know, when the band are rehearsing and writing and whatnot and developing the work, he's typically working nearby them.
Yeah.
You know, so that he's kind of part of what's going on in such a way. And I think, you know, it seems pretty clear that him and Tom York are, you know, pretty much in touch a lot of the time outside of that as well, you know. So I think they're pretty good friends.
Well, and I was going to ask you about something else, but I often wonder if Tom says a lot of things tongue-in-cheek, or that he doesn't really believe, because he mentioned something about how the only concept behind OK Computer was to be a collection of songs called OK Computer. But I wonder, are we reading too much into it, or is Tom just being a little bit kind of cheeky?
I think, you know, especially with that example that you talk about, or that you just raised, I think he probably doesn't realize the extent to which it was a concept album. I think there are things there that, you know, were not necessarily done consciously or intentionally. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, I'm not sure he's talking tongue-in-cheek just as much as he might not actually realize, you know, the extent to which what he's done, you know what I mean? Like the true nature of what they've done.
Well, and maybe they did start to think that way later. I mean, for me anyways, I think that albums like Kid A and Amnesiac, and especially Hail to the Thief, where they really seem to have a sort of theme to them after September 11th, which I want to talk about in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in a way, Kid A and Amnesiac might have been their most kind of, if you want to talk about concept album, like they seem to have sort of a thread that obviously runs between the two records.
between Kid A and Amnesiac.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, there's a link that Tom York makes at one point where he talks about, you know, in Kid A, the fires are all in the distance. In Amnesiac and with the album cover work, you are in the fire. And by the time you get to Hail to the Thief, you're among just the charred remains of the fire in terms of the album cover. So, I mean, they're kind of linked even in that way.
It's interesting, too, because I often view, and this might be right or wrong, I don't know, but I view Kid A, Amnesiac, and Hail to the Thief as kind of, I don't want to say a unit, but they represent an era to me of sonic exploration and of the world at that time. And in many ways, Kid A and Amnesiac, which came out just the summer before September 11th, I feel like they were a premonition. And Tom York himself even mentions how he feels his music presages events.
Right.
So I got sort of a twofold question here, and the first one is almost metaphysical, but do you think that artists are somehow able to tap into sort of a continuum of time and almost like interpret things that are about to happen or are kind of seeding in society?
Yeah, and I think it's in large part to do with perception, because, you know, most artists are really in the business of updating and retraining sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it's through our sensibility that, you know, we kind of, it sets the stage for the interface of our, you know, perception of our environment, you know. And part of that updating of sensibility, I think, is related to how we should go about proceeding, you know, with these sorts of changes. And one of the things that's interesting about, you know, sensibility and thinking about sensibility is how, you know, you might or we might listen to previous ages of, say, music, and just be totally out of sync with it or unable to, you know, get inside of it. In fact, I know older people or people that are older than myself that, you know, could not really get inside Radiohead musically and to appreciate the sensibility that is being expressed. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that's kind of a generational thing. And I guess, you know, we could say that it sort of makes the artist's position historically very important in terms of, you know, what they may be.
Yeah, even that much more connected. On. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, given even the surroundings of 9/11, the terrorist attacks, I mean, other albums at the time like Wilco's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, and I mean, even the liner notes to Amnesiac, you talk about in your book how there was images of towers burning in there, very dystopian. It almost seems like artists were somehow channeling the future. And I know that sounds kind of out there, but when a lot of artists even talk about writing their songs, they often say that it feels like it came from some other entity. So yeah. I wonder to what extent, you know, Radiohead experiences that. And I wonder if it's, you know, influencing, for example, Tom York's writing more than we realize.
Yeah, I think it probably is. I mean, I think there's kind of a mystical sort of thing about it. And I mean, you know, people like Marshall McLuhan have, you know, pointed out the parallel between, you know, artists in our culture and shamans in you know, more traditional cultures, who are kind of tasked with, you know, spiritual guidance, but also just, you know, how to respond to the world in general. And so I think that, you know, there's obviously a mystical element that goes into being a shaman, but I think because there is something fundamentally mystical about being alive in the first place, I think that also is part of what, you know, a lot of artists feeling like conduits for something, some other kind of expressive force than just themselves all the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And while we're talking about the metaphysical, you've drawn some similarities, of course, between the Beatles and Radiohead, of which there are many, especially for the different generations. And many people, myself included, would consider Radiohead to be the Beatles of our era, if not for the immense popularity. But the Beatles were very loud about their use of drugs in particular. Do you think that Radiohead, some of their music, it's hard to imagine how it came to be without drugs, but they're really not talking about that. And it's questionable if they would even be doing those kind of things. So do you think that there's any sort of connection between Radiohead and hallucinogenic drugs like there was with the Beatles?
I'm not sure that there's much reason to necessarily think they use hallucinogenic drugs, although there was a note of just Ed showing up to the Grammys after having taken mushrooms. So I presume that mushrooms is maybe occasionally, part of what they might do. And certainly, there's a number of references that you could come across to them talking about, marijuana. If there were other drugs involved in their lives, I'd be surprised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they've kept it together so well as rock musicians. I mean, the ones that were really into drugs died early,
and it's interesting, because, we found out McCartney smoked marijuana every day of his life since he started, taking it back in the 60s. But you wouldn't expect that he probably tried too much LSD after, the late 60s, presumably.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because that sort of responsibility of Radiohead is one of the things that I think has led them to a prolonged and fulfilling career. I mean, they haven't burned out. They're still looking good for their 30 years of doing rock music at this point, and they're still alive, which is a big thing.
That's right. And I think, when you can see even earlier photos of them, in their beginnings where, you see them smoking quite a bit, but I haven't seen sort of more recent photos of them smoking. So, I'd be surprised if any of them smoke,
in some ways they're the world's most, boring and down-to-earth rock stars, and I've had people describe them who've met them in that way too. I was able to talk to someone who recorded saxophone on Kid A, and he described the studio with the band as like just showing up to, a hang with some friends, and it was nice to know that they're that, approachable and down-to-earth, and, you hear some real horror stories about other artists, so.
Yeah, no, it'd be, I'm sure, quite a bit of fun to sit down and talk with them, let alone play on their album.
Oh yeah, I know. It's like a dream come true. So, but back to the 9/11, premonition stuff and all that related things we were talking about there. The timing of Kid A Amnesiac seems so interesting to me because it was at a time, I don't want to say that the pre-2001 era was innocent, but it kind of was, and that might just be because I was younger, but I think as a society, the 90s were kind of a fleeting time. We didn't realize how special they were in a way, because everything changed.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, actually. And I think it, for me at least, it's most obvious in terms of activism because, up until the late 90s and then even until, 9/11, these massive protests of the sort of global international economic institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and et cetera. There were all of these constant, massive demonstrations going on against them. And following 9/11, that activity has diminished considerably, probably for a number of reasons. But one of which I would say is that there has been a chill on activism, much like the chill that is felt in Fitter Happier
yeah.
already. You know what I mean?
Totally.
But that chill, has, come along with the idea and the knowledge that, we're all being surveilled. And that,
Well, yeah, Kid A Amnesiac really marks the end of an era to me, and it's also kind of an era of innocence where it's sort of just about itself. I know they're very dark and foreboding and all that, but they also have a sense of innocence to them, which I think they struggled with later on Hail to the Thief, trying to absorb not only the fact that they had children at that time, which they were just bringing into the world, but also September 11th had happened, and the George Bush, alleged theft of the election had happened, and these are all things that weighed very heavily on their mind. And I think it, in some way, I don't want to say it ruined the album, but it took the album to a place where Kid A and Amnesiac didn't even try to go.
And can you maybe say a little bit more about what you mean?
Oh, what I mean, I guess, is that, Kid A, I would look at...
You mean in terms of the... Sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Well, Kid A, I would look at as an exploration of the musical art they were trying to create. And Amnesiac, I would do kind of a same kind of concept. They were exploring what's possible in the studio as artists. Whereas Hail to the Thief, I would say, especially where the lyrics become more cohesive again on some tracks. And, the references to 2 + 2 = 5, very, very blatantly like that. They're clearly trying to discuss the dystopian future with which not only, you said was from afar on Kid A, but is now in reality.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you're saying because there's a number of things that happen there. One, Hail to the Thief is recorded extremely quickly. By comparison with those, previous albums, and even the band and Godrich talk about wanting to have a second chance at doing that one because it was interesting because it was done, and the imperative to be quick was in response to how long the other albums took, right? And so they wanted to, at Godrich's insistence, to try and get this done in the matter of weeks. So there's that. There's also, I think, the fact that they had outgrown the crisis, the personal kind of creative crisis of the band by that point, in the sense, and I think that's indicative in them including the lyrics in that album, Hail to the Thief. And so, I think that a lot of the themes that are inherent, for example, there's so much violence going on in Kid A and Amnesiac in various sorts of settings, including, there's just a number of things. But, I think that all presages the official use of torture that follows, 9/11, with, at least in the presidency of George Bush. And so I think, a lot of the things that are inherent, especially scapegoating, for example, that seems to be just everywhere in Radiohead after, including and after OK Computer. And I think that's, present in Life in a Glass House, for instance, just as, for example, we're hungry for a lynching. That kind of gets, with Hail to the Thief, there's a lot of York's comment about, just the concern for fascism, which is really quite interesting because that really does presage what's happening now. I could see it, I think, as well as he did at the time, that, basically the groundwork for the you're either with us or against us of, the war on terror was this kind of a scapegoating sort of thing.
Well, the lyrics for this become so literal too. Like a song like Sail to the Moon, maybe you'll be president, but know right from wrong. Like that's a fairly straightforward lyric. you
right.
Contrast that to something from Warning Bell, like the clothes are on the lawn with the furniture, cut the kids in half. Like, what?
That's right.
What is that even about? But this is very clearly a protest song.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also, a lot of throughout Kid A and Amnesiac, and often it's just present in some of the scrawlings on the album compact disc notes. But there's all this reference to slavery and having slaves as well, and there's kind of this sense that the children, towards the end there in Morning Bell are, also being potentially taken for slaves or something.
I heard that song was actually about a divorce, which would make sense.
Of Morning Bell?
Yeah, in some way.
Yeah,
throwing the clothes on the lawn, the kids are being cut in half, everything's being split, kind of it's hard to say what any of those songs are really about, so. Well, Phil, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today, and I do feel badly because we talked, or you shared another interview with me, which I'll put in the show notes for this because it was also a great listen. But I said that I wouldn't cut you off, and unfortunately, I do have a hard stop today after all, which is kind of ironic.
Okay.
But
we can always sit down again. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Sean.
Yeah, you'll have to promise me to come back. So before we go, I know we kind of went into the weeds. That's what this podcast is for, is delving deep into Radiohead. But where can people pick up your book and learn more about you?
I guess I would point people to the internet as the
like
most
Amazon,
likely.
Okay.
Yeah, or you could probably buy it directly from the publisher as well in the U.S. Or your preferred book dealer, I guess. Similarly, I guess if you wanted to find out anything more about myself, you're probably going to find it on the internet too.
Have you got a website we could head to? Or
I don't have a website, but yeah, pretty much anything I'm up to, you can find out from there. If you wanted to see what I've published, you could go to the Amazon page or the Goodreads page, that kind of thing. All my books would be part of that, or included there.
Well, you know what I'll do is I'll in the show notes for this episode, I will throw an Amazon link up to the ebook and the physical book that people can click on and head right to that and support your efforts. So thank you for writing this book. Thanks for your taking Radiohead so seriously. And as a fellow Canadian, I definitely have enjoyed talking to you today.
Likewise, Sean. Good talking to you.
For show notes for today's episode, including a link to Phil's book called Radiohead, Music for a Global Future, see okpodcast.com/7. If you enjoyed today's conversation and have some stories yourself you'd like to share about Radiohead, I invite you to come on the show. You can send me a message at hello@okpodcast.com. As you heard, this conversation is super laid back, super easy. I do edit, so if you say something stupid, I'll cut it out. Don't worry about it. And I will come up with all the questions. You don't have to do anything. All that I ask is that you please send me sort of a Radiohead resume, some of the shows you've been to, maybe why you love them as a band. And you don't have to have been a super long time fan either. I want to talk to older fans who've been to, 28 concerts since the beginning of the time of the band, but also maybe people who've just recently discovered Radiohead and sort of their perspective on how it is versus modern music of other sort of types. So anyways, give me a shout at hello@okpodcast.com, and thank you so much for listening to today's show. Today's episode of the podcast was brought to you in part by D'Addario. Don't forget to check out their playback program, which recycles strings and helps save the environment. Guitar, bass, or orchestral strings are eligible, and you can learn more at D'Addario.com/playback. Also, did you know that Patreon supporters get access to an extended ad-free version of the podcast? Check it out at okpodcast.com and get access for as little as $1 a month.